Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second discussion in our community-based webinar series. In today's roundtable discussion, students will hear from our lovely speaker about how they're engaging in community-based research at the intersections of queerness and gender, and we'll also have an open Q&A portion at the end. Just as a reminder, our introductory discussion around community-based research was recorded, and you can find the video posted on the CSA YouTube's channel. I'll also put the link in the chat here. And on March 3rd at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will also be hosting the next webinar in the series, which focuses on community-based research at the intersections of race and indigeneity. The link for more information on that and to register, I'll also be putting in the chat. While we meet here on a virtual platform, we do need to take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are located. We acknowledge the territories to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous people and their culture. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, First Nation, and Métis people. As I'm speaking from the city of Calgary, the following land acknowledgement will be for that area. I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Wesley First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We invite you all to learn more about the territory on which you reside. You can check out the website on the screen, native-land.ca, to learn more. As for who I am, hello, my name is Jay. I use they, them, or Z0 pronouns. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Calgary in the Sociology department, and I'm also a member of the CSA Student Concerns Subcommittee, and I will be acting as the moderator for today's discussion. For today's webinar, the Zoom-generated closed captioning is available as live transcript. We ask that you save your questions for the second half of the discussion. You can answer the questions through the Q&A feature here. Please note that your name and the question will be visible to all attendees. You can also upvote questions to the top of the list. So if you see one someone's already asked that you would also like answered, feel free to upvote that. All of these features you can find by scrolling your cursor towards the bottom of your screen to find the toolbar. For today, our speaker is the wonderful Pedrom Nasiri, they, them pronouns. They are a PhD student at the University of Calgary. Pedrom Nasiri is a Joseph Armand Bombardier doctoral student in the Department of Sociology at UCalgary, working under the supervision of Dr. Pallavi Banerjee. Pedrom is also the 2020 Student Awardee of the SWS Student Action Initiative Award and the Canadian Sociological Association's Angus Reid Award for Social Activism. Their doctoral research employs critical phenomenology and intersectionality to examine how the increasing prevalence of polyqueer families articulate with ongoing racial, gender, and class formation projects. In addition to their doctoral work, Pedrom holds the position of Research Project Coordinator for a community-based research project federally funded by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. The project explores how the experiences and understandings of newcomer youth regarding race and racism transform during the resettlement process, and how such experiences and understandings may disorient programming provided by resettlement agencies towards anti-racist frameworks and an intersectional ethics of care. Pedrom completed their MA at the University of Toronto in the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, where they explored the experiences of queer Muslim refugees in the Canadian asylum apparatus. Much of Pedrom's work is guided by critical social theories that emphasize the need to employ academic theory and inquiry to address everyday social injustices. Pedrom has worked with various governmental and non-governmental agencies across Canada to address long-standing inequities in healthcare and social service systems. Pedrom has been recognized for this work by the Order of St. John, the Lieutenant Governor of Alberta, and the Governor General of Canada. and I will let them take it over from here.
As Jay so wonderfully mentioned, my name is Pedrom Nasiri. I'm a doctoral candidate and a research project coordinator at the University of Calgary, and I'm currently working on two different community-based research initiatives. The first is my doctoral research, which looks at polyqueer families both in Canada and the United States. And then the second is the work that I'm doing with the Yari Collective, housed at the University of Calgary, that specifically deals with newcomer youth and their experiences of the resettlement process. What I'll be speaking about today is my doctoral research, but if anybody has questions specifically about my other work, I'm more than happy to engage in conversation about that. As a result of my work with the Yari Collective, I do have experience reaching for or seeking funding with broad-scale partners such as Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, in addition to smaller agencies or smaller non-governmental organizations that I've been pursuing with my doctoral work. Okay. So what I have in mind for us today is just to, with this conversation, is just to orient folks to my conception of community-based research, recognizing that there are many different avenues that one can explore when it comes to CBR. You've got things like participatory action research, community-based participatory action research, community-based participation. And so really they come with their own sort of guiding frameworks about how it is that we should be doing, right? CBR. But what you're going to hear from me today is purely my own orientation, right, based off of the various different strands that we have together. I would like to thank the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, as well as Sociologists Women in Society, for their generous support of this research project when it comes to writing polyqueer worlds. They have been fantastic supporters all the way through, and SWS has been a wonderful place for me to speak to some of the community initiatives and concerns that we are exploring today. So when it comes to community-based research, I view it as a counter-hegemonic practice, right? And CBR seeks to disrupt our taken for granted understandings and relationships between, the researcher and the researched. I don't view it so much as a method, as it is an axiological commitment, right? A specific commitment to a certain way of doing things, right, within an ethical framework, right, or a particular moral and values set. So what this translates into is more of a methodological orientation as opposed to a strict method per se. So that goes back to, my quick overview of CBPR and the many different avenues that you could be taking with their own sort of methods, right? But underlying this is more of a methodological orientation to how we can conduct research as researchers in more ethical ways. There are three general criteria across all types of community-based research that folks typically orient to. We've got collaboration between researcher and communities, a democratization of knowledge, and of course, a commitment to social justice, right? Working with communities and following community leads for social justice transformation. And hopping into collaboration then, Cornwall and Jukes tell us it's about listening to the needs, anxieties, right, and knowledge from communities. The communities that we work with are very much experts in their own lived experiences, the ways in which hegemonic structures orient them within their everyday worlds. And so they come with this specialized knowledge, right, that we should be orienting to and collaborating with, right, listening deeply and meaningfully. When it comes to the design of the work, right, that collaborative process is iterative. We are constantly moving back to forms of research design, a research implementation, right, the various methods that we're using, the various different types of practices we're employing, research analysis, right, and then of course, the dissemination of our results. But all of this collaboration is an iterative process. At all points during design, implementation, analysis, or dissemination, I'm constantly engaging with community community members, right, and specifically an advisory group that I'll talk about later on, about what the community would like me to do here, right, or what is in the best interests of community, and how we can even tackle research questions in a more meaningful manner. And I can explain a little bit more about that later on. And of course, going back to Cornwall and Jukes, right, with regards to that collaboration with knowledge production, right, a lot of CBPR is based off of co-learning principles that we get from critical pedagogists such as Freire. Who recognize that both researcher and researched, or researcher and communities, are transformed in these moments of co-learning, right? Building off of the knowledge of one another and orienting towards social justice frameworks that allow for greater forms of equity transformation. When it comes to the democratization of research, the way I view it is, you know, my primary responsibility is going to be to the communities that I'm involved with. So I incorporate and work with community, as I've mentioned, right, iteratively at every stage of the research process. But also, most importantly, with the dissemination of findings. I recognize, and I can speak to this later if it pops up, right, is that some knowledge is solely for community. Not everything needs to be reported on, not everything needs to end up in an article or a book, right? Sometimes I'm just bearing witness to the stories that are being shared with me. And so it's important for me to recognize, right, what stories are permitted for me to share with others, and which ones I'm, as I've mentioned, solely bearing witness to. And so engaging with community members about that, right, the knowledge dissemination production, right, is an important process of my CBR. And of course, speaking with community about what policies and recommendations, right, they would like us to employ when it comes to the research results, right? These are what research is finding, you know, what initiatives, right, from this can we sort of explore and build upon with community, right? Very rarely have I ever, and I cannot think of a moment, I say very rarely as an, you know, a point of caution, but very rarely have I ever engaged in any sort of policy, social policy development, or forms of policy recommendations without the backing of community. And of course, reflection on knowledge inclusion and exclusion. And so what I mean to orient to here are the ways in which we include, right, work as academics to bring in concert different ways of thinking about a particular social problem. Who we're citing is also an important recognition in my work, taking into account, you know, the global economy of knowledge production, whose voices are disproportionately silenced in that economy, and addressing those from a social justice lens. And this is one of the biggest components, you know, it sort of feeds into the democratization of knowledge. It also feeds into collaboration. But for CBPR or CBR specifically, right, my work is always there not only to try and describe the everyday world or the social phenomenon that I would like to explore, but also to then work and deconstruct, transform, improve upon, right, that everyday world. Often it's to challenge taken for granted assumptions in order to make room within this life world for other orientations. Of course, when it comes to this, again, you're going to hear me preface this, right, or emphasize this throughout. There is significant community involvement in the types of social justice actions that I decide to take up with community members. Right, I have the privilege to be working with these community members, and so I will always work with them rather than for them. And of course, building capacity. And I'm going to tie in what that looks like specifically for writing polyqueer worlds and the polyqueer families that I'm in communication with for this research project later on. But it's mainly about building sustainability, right? Building a more equitable world within which they can thrive, and dismantling forms of hegemonic knowledge and power structures. Some things that I've often had to consider within my work, right, is relations of power. power between me as a researcher and the researched, even though, for example, the community that I'm engaging with, writing Polyqueer Worlds, right, I am an insider to in some ways, I'm also an outsider. And so, you know, Collins's orientation to that outsider within, right, insider-outsider relationship is an important consideration for me to engage with throughout my research process, recognizing that my sort of positionality as a researcher, right? I'm going to be writing these articles, I'm going to be writing book chapters, I'm going to be writing social policies, right? Positions me as the translator of the social phenomenon that I'm working with community to investigate. So how can we tackle these meaningfully? You know, that relation and positionality of power, how can we tackle that meaningfully beyond adding someone in as a co-author, right? What does it mean to speak in concert with community more broadly is something that I've often tried to contend with. Something that I've often faced as well doing community-based research is critiques regarding methodological rigor, right? How is it that you could conduct objective, right, or sound research if you're working from the standpoint of community, right, as opposed to the standpoint of the removed or abstracted researcher? So this is another contention that I've brushed up with in my research, and I've often fallen onto, you know, the critical interrogation of what that means from feminist standpoint theorists. Critical race feminists and Southern theory have played a big role in me being able to articulate, you know, the importance of community-based research and just how, actually, I'm not going to use that term, I was going to just how rigorous it is in comparison to other, but rather how the considerations of methodological rigor bring us back to taken for granted assumptions about the production of knowledge, right, and the positionality of the colonial metropole as the be-all and end-all from which knowledge is produced. Of course, another thing that I've had to consider is, you know, the people I'm communicating with institutional review boards, ethical committees, right, funding agencies. The language that I'm going to use is really dependent upon the people that I'm speaking to in this moment in order to stress the importance of community-based research. And of course, another consideration then in not just communicating with IRBs and funding agencies, but then is navigating the differences in the ways in which everyday life is structured, or the administrations are structured, or the criteria required, right, in order to conduct this research based off of the viewpoints of IRBs, funding agencies, and community. Often what's best for community from community standpoint, right, may push against the grain of institutional review boards, or may not necessarily align perfectly with the criteria for funding agencies. So how can we navigate this as members of communities or working with communities, right, and acting as a researcher? And then, of course, this need that I have to keep coming back to every now and again and remind myself of is flexibility. Right, recognizing that during these navigating the waters of IRB, funding agencies, and community, sometimes things don't necessarily align perfectly straight, and finding comfort in Ahmed there about, you know, what straightness means as an orientation and how sometimes it might be okay to deviate or disorient away from the straightness of bureaucracy. So maintaining a degree of flexibility is something I always try to consider throughout my community-based research practices. Reflexivity, again, thinking about my positionality in relation to community, thinking about my positionality within the academy, and constantly going back to that axiological commitment that I've made, right, at the fundamental core of my researcher being, right, of am I doing community work here, right? Am I working with community rather than for them? Am I speaking for them? Am I speaking with them, right? Whose viewpoints am I bringing to the surface here, and whose considerations am I taking to task when it comes to social policy development? And of course, iteration. Right, constantly going backwards and forwards, making sure that community is brought in at everyone as much as possible throughout the entire research process. Some challenges that I've run into when it comes to CBR, and that seems to be universal to a certain extent, is that it tends to be a more time-consuming process. right? Bringing community in the design stages of the research project, then the implementation, then the analysis, and then the dissemination requires the coordination of multiple different schedules, multiple different considerations of what time is and how urgency materializes. And so it does occupy a lot more of my time, let's say, right, in comparison to more traditional research that does not necessarily draw on CBR. Of course, there's also the ethical considerations that need to be made along the way, right? Whose interest is this really? Who's benefiting from this work as researchers, working with community, but also within the academy? There are needs to consider, who is going to be benefiting from this work, because I will also be benefiting, right, from this work, just tacitly, right, with my engagement as a researcher, right, someone who can speak with community, but about community as well. So whose interest, right? And then, of course, it can be quite costly if we are going to be just in our working with community, right? It can be time consuming, but it can also be a significant cost associated with it. So finding funding opportunities has been always an important part of my work, even outside of my graduate degree. Okay. So I thought I would provide us in the next 20 minutes here just a quick orientation to my work on writing polyqueer worlds as a more concretized example of the CBR that I employ. Always, right, with CBR work, but even like good academic work, I think positionality is something that we should be continually reflecting on beyond even just the Butlerian checkboxes, as Butler would say, right? It's not just there for us to list the various sorts of marginalized identities or positionalities we maintain, or the various sort of marginal social groups that we interact with or engaged with, right? But rather for us to critically think about, right, our orientations as a result of these intersecting social frameworks. So the general orienting question that I came up with during this time, as a result of my own experiences, my own positionality, was, given the importance of polygamy to the formation of Canada as a white settler state and its entrenchment, right, as a barbaric cultural practices, right? Polygamy's entrenchment as a barbaric cultural practice. Why are Canada's legal regimes now orienting toward multiple partner families as something that is beneficial, right, in the best interest of the child, right? Or something that is supposed to be a reflection of more contemporary family practices? What's going on here? And so what I decided to do was, as opposed to just simply taking up my framework, right, as if that is the be-all and end-all, I explored the literature. And what I saw over and over again in conversations within these articles was a deep reflection on white families, or a deep reflection on the inclusion of white folks within, right, polyamorous works. There was very little that I could actually find when it comes to the inclusion of BIPOC folks or QT BIPOC folks. And so what I decided to do then was actually start to seek out other individuals who are located at similar intersections as myself, in order to have informal coffee shop conversations in, groups of 1-on-1 or 1-on-3, right, where they would invite their partners and so forth, to just talk about some of these landscape changes, legal landscape changes within Canada, and what it meant for them, right? Any issues that they were running into, right, within predominantly white spaces when it comes to their non-monogamous family practices. From there, sort of built out into broader conversations, and these were larger community conversations with 6 groups of about 5 community members, so 30 folks altogether. And again, just sort of reflecting on their lived experiences, right, in consideration with my own positionality and what was happening at this point in time with regards to that legal regime. And what we were hearing, in addition to being excluded, right, from academic considerations or reflections on self-help literature when it comes to how to orient to polyamorous families or non-monogamous families more broadly, was a complete exclusion, right, of BIPOC folk. But it also led to an extreme sense of loneliness across many of these individuals and many of these families that I came in contact with. And so working with community then, right, and drawing in on these conversations, we actually established PolyAmQ, Calgary's queer and polyamorous community that emphasized a place for QT BIPOC folk. And so we built out this community in addition to starting conversations about what is needed, right, in order to address social policy transformation more broadly, and this shifting terrain of the family law regime and the legal regime in Canada in order to be more inclusive of QT BIPOC non-monogamous families. From those conversations, I actually had the opportunity to challenge, right, my own taken for granted assumptions about the original research question. It was a very structural, very macro question. And what I was hearing from folks that I was drawing into community, the QT BIPOC, polyamorous and non-monogamous folk, is that they were more interested as well in the everyday survival strategies that were occurring within these families. Right. So how is it that folks are managing to navigate a terrain that is wholly violent towards their own orientations to non-monogamy, right, at the intersections of race, sexuality, and gender, and what sort of resources could be shared across PolyAmQ as a result of this? And so my research questions, or my initial orienting question, expanded a little bit more to look at how intersectional knowledge projects are actually influencing the experiences of conjugal multiple partner families, specifically QT BIPOC families, right, perceptions and interpretations of their everyday lived existence. So this was something that community had specifically asked for in order for them to develop a greater understanding, and that certainly disrupt some of the loneliness that they were feeling, right, or the challenges that they were feeling in everyday life. And then we can see then the refinement of my own question in that second part. How do these knowledge projects intersect with and become mobilized through conceptions of legality and citizenship? I was very interested in a small component of the family law regime, right, specifically parent-child relationships, and actually in communication with community members, the sort of problematic that I was looking at, the challenges that they were facing, were more broad than I could have imagined. Citizenship played a huge role in the ways in which a lot of these families were navigating themselves, because their support structures would actually extend beyond national borders, right? Many folks would have loved ones in the US, or in Australia, or in Europe, somewhere in Africa, right? And so when we look at that original conceptualization that I had of just family law regime and that parent-child relationship, I was negating the fact that how, or rather eliding and hiding or overlooking the fact that parenting relationships can extend beyond borders. And so that was a really good orientation that community provided me in this moment, right? This pushback and asking me to check my own sort of taken for granted assumptions about what parenting looks like in the everyday. So that was really interesting and really helpful for me as a researcher, right, and working with community. In conversation with community then, I brought in the theoretical frameworks of intersectionality, queer of color critique, and critical phenomenology for three principal reasons, right? All three of those work to sort of recognize how single axis cognitive frameworks elide the multidimensionality of lived experience. The more I've worked in conversation with these theoretical frameworks, right, and the scholars within them, the more that I've recognized the importance of making room for that multidimensionality, right? And how CBR actually expands our orientation as researchers, right, to do greater justice in some ways, right, to that multiplicity of lived experience. In addition as well, to not only describe forms of social injustice that I've mentioned, but work towards dismantling and disorienting hegemonic structures that frame our everyday worlds. Much of my training as a social and cultural anthropologist, and then as a beginning sociologist, so to speak, right, has been in description. My job is there to find others, describe others, speak about others, analyze others, disseminate the results that I've produced on others. And it wasn't until my current supervisor during my sociology PhD, that I actually started to recognize the importance of not only describing these, right, but also more so in some cases pushing against, right, dismantling, disorienting hegemonic structures that lead to forms of social justice in the everyday. Which again is point number 3 here, naming and decentering. That has become a big part of my CBR work, right, is naming what is happening in these moments with community members, right? If I'm incorrectly oriented to a particular structure, I'm open, right, and willing to reflexively engage in that and be oriented to something that is causing forms of social injustice or inequity in everyday life, naming it, and then working with community, right, to transform that in meaningful ways for community. When it comes to the research project, there were 4 basic stages, right? Phase 5, the dissemination, is what I'm currently in. So I'm just working on the dissemination of results now. And again, analysis is ongoing. But the first one was the exploratory phase, right? As I've mentioned, this was the interview with community members and leaders. Phase 2, I saw as building that community, working with community in order to build something that they wanted, right? Something that they specifically articulated in my conversation with them, in addition to what I was interested in. And this sort of orients to more of Minion Moore's discussion about the importance of leaving something sustainable and tangible for community when we leave it, right? Often as researchers, we enter into space, we extract, and then we leave. What I was orienting to in these moments, right, with critical race feminists such as Minion Moore, is what can I leave behind, or what can I work with community in order to maintain, right, the community that was present before, but also one we were building together. So there was that creation of a community organization, and we would regularly hold conversation cafes, town halls, conferences, and game nights. It's still it's still active, still ongoing, and these would be spaces where we could simply work against some of the loneliness that folks were originally articulating, but then also work to transform knowledge and mobilize knowledge outside of the academy, such as with the PolyAmQ Horizons conference. I did form an advisory group, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment here, and of course sought funding for this work from SSHRC and SWS. As I've mentioned, capacity building is something that's near and dear to my heart and something that is an intrinsic part of CBR. So we look at sustainability. And so going back to PolyAmQ and the creation of that community organization of 173 active members, I want to say, that is something tangible that and sustainable that could be left behind outside of this project, right? So if I'm not successful, right, I am very much an early scholar, like an early career scholar. If I messed up along the way, right, is there something that I could give community? That this was at the back of my mind. Is there something that I can leave community with, right, that would do them justice? And so that was something that I saw here. When it comes to sustainability and dissemination of my results, right, and how to build and work for this community, this is something that I'm really emphasizing and trying to focus on in these moments, right, is how can I do justice and essentially bring the communities that I'm working with into conversation with academic literature that's already in place. Certainly resistance, part of that capacity building is resisting against, at least the way I see it, resisting against white supremacist structures that are foundational, right, or built into a lot of literature on non-monogamy, and then transforming. Not just academic literature or the academic sphere, but then also everyday life, right? How is it that we can shift that taken for granted world in which polyamorous folks orient, right? And how can we shift that to more inclusive structures? As I've mentioned, I have yet to really get into the dissemination stages. I'm in the analysis and the writing stages of my work, so this is quite new to me, but I have engaged with discussions around dissemination. Where should I be sending these things out to? How should I be going about this? What sort of engagement would community members, and especially the advisory group that I have, like to incorporate when it comes to the dissemination, recognizing that my doctoral dissertation is specifically coming from this research and the power relations that are involved in that. And then an emphasis that actually came from within community of public documents. So not necessarily social policies or anything along those lines, but rather information booklets, right? Public documents that they can send around to other communities, the Canadian Polyamory Advocacy Association, right? Or other folks who are facing that degree of loneliness, right? So that they can recognize that there is community out there for them, there are spaces for them, and they can grow with them, right? And so it's not just within the academy or within governmental spheres, but then within their everyday structures too. I've already spoken quite a bit about this, so I don't think I'll take up too much time. Some of the challenges that I've faced, of course, are ethical issues. What IRBs want in relation to what communities might ask for is significantly different. So how can we take that extra step towards what communities want, right, with regards to ethical practice, and orient IRBs to some of the entrenched positivist, right, or colonial practices that they may incorporate. Power relations, as I've mentioned, it's taken me a long time to work through this. So far with my doctoral work, I think I'm now at a year 6 PhD, and it's coming to the end, but it's been a lot longer just because of the consultation processes that I've tried to incorporate throughout. Flexibility, absolutely. Bridging the divide between academic and community priorities. Often these are very different. And I can speak to that if you'd like, but I've often found, what the community wants is not necessarily what academics want, or what the academy wants, and so how can you navigate that appropriately? This has been a challenge. And then funding. I've learned that there's a specific way to write funding applications for CBR in order to emphasize the need. And so how to effectively incorporate community into those applications has been certainly a challenge at first, but it's become significantly easier with time. And then, of course, confidentiality and data security. Okay, I think I'll leave it here then. Just want to say thank you so much to the University of Calgary's for inviting me to this talk, the Canadian Sociological Association, and Sherry Fox and Jay Overholser for their wonderful assistance with this presentation.